again, everybody. So good to have you with us again today. It's so good to have Steve, Chris, and Ceswe join us again today. Again, just to chat about life and faith in the real world for young adults. And it's so lucky to just tackle some of the questions young adults have. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them. So send them through. And today's question, again, a tough one. What happens to those who haven't heard the gospel? Or those who haven't heard about Jesus? What happens to their soul? And again, this is for us a difficult one because there's a lot of what ifs. And how do we process that? And how do we deal with that? And how do we answer this question? So stick with us. As Tris says, join us, grab a cup of coffee, kick back, and enjoy the conversation as we get into it. So, boys, how's everyone doing today? We all good?
All good.
Excellent. And thanks to Dunks for last week. It was quite a belter. Good to have Steve was on holiday and Trist, you was on holiday, but thanks for dialing in for that 1 second.
I was there. I was representing, albeit
Absolutely.
via a buffering kind of vibe.
So, guys, today the question: what happens to those who haven't heard the gospel? Will they be saved? Will they get to go to heaven? What happens to their soul? But maybe a starting point, and this was for me something that came up before I understood what it meant to be saved, was Christians all around me were saying, I know, it would be so lucky if Daryl was saved. And for me, having very little knowledge, having known about a God out there in the universe, I didn't know what they were talking about and what I needed saving from. So there might be some people out there not knowing that they need to be saved or that there's anything to worry about. So I want to throw it out there. Anyone want to tackle this first one? And what do people need saving from, and why? You know, anybody?
I can take that one.
Yeah, go this is.
I'll throw it to Steve next with a follow-up question. I think the easy one is it's because of sin. We sin and we disobey God, and because God is a just God, he then follows up with the punishment of sin. So that's why I think we need to be, that's what we need to be saved from. But then I think the follow-up question is to Steve, why is sin so bad? What is so bad about sin?
Yeah, I mean, sin's one of those words that I think can just lose all of its meaning. Either because sometimes we talk about sin as if it's just this little, you told a lie, that's a naughty sin. So now you're a naughty boy, you're a naughty girl. And there's also kind of sins that the church kind of says are bad, but the world actually celebrates but we actually like this and we don't think there's anything wrong with this. And expressing myself sexually like this actually feels amazing. So, and as all of these compete for definition, sin really seems to, the word loses its power. And I think if we look at it from a Christian dimension, there are a number of ways of looking at it, but sin is ultimately, I think there's a vertical and a horizontal dimension. And so if you're cynical, you're maybe not thinking about the vertical dimension, vertical meaning between me and God. But it's, I think, easy to show the horizontal dimension that doesn't matter who you are, you can identify destructive patterns of behavior in your life that actually, they're destructive. They work against who you are, you being a whole, fully functional, thriving person. I think every human can agree with the fact that you're your own worst enemy. You let yourself down more than anybody else does. And even if you consider yourself a good person, you've let others down. There are plenty people that feel deeply let down by you, and you've hurt in greater and lesser ways. And as you compound that, there's 5 people involved in this chat, and if we just think about all the people that us 5 have hurt and injured and maybe irreparably, we're starting to talk about hundreds of people that we've impacted negatively. Now multiply that by 7 point whatever billion people there are in the world, and it's no wonder the world's such a messed up place. So sin is very easy just to recognize. I've got blind spots, I've got incapacities, I've got weaknesses, I've got things in my life that destroy me, destroy others, destroy relationship. And the Christian understanding of sin adds, as a primary point of reference, the vertical dimension, that all of that sin ultimately finds its mark against God. And the reason is, if I sin against you, says where God made you as his child, as his image bearer. And just like my son is my child and my image bearer, if someone sins against my child, I take offense to that. And so if I sin against you, God is the one standing behind you as your father and as the one you represent. And so ultimately my mark is against him. And so if we compound that, all the world's sins against humanity eventually find themselves against God. And that leaves God in a state of, there is just clearly a problem here. And because he is who he is, and because he wants us to be in right relationship with him, and he wants us to be in right relationship with ourselves and with one another, he is wanting to deal with that, and he's wanting to hold us accountable to that. So that's just my quick answer as to why sin is so serious.
I think, there's so much more that you could elaborate on that, known as the gospel and salvation message, and just the work of what Jesus came to do here on earth. And so, again, this question that we're dealing with, what about those who haven't heard this message of salvation? What happens to them? And so that's the difficulty, in that we know that this message saves people from an eternity away from Jesus. And it gives us an eternity with Jesus. And again, the term heaven comes to mind. We want to be with God in heaven forever. And this is what the gospel and the salvation message means. And so the question we're dealing with today, what happens to those who haven't quite heard that message? Do they stand a chance? Will they get to be with God in heaven if they haven't heard the message of Jesus? And so that's why all the what ifs. It brings about feelings of, man, that's not fair for the people who haven't heard this message. Yeah. It brings about a sense of guilt for Christians to say, man, why aren't you going to the ends of the earth to tell people about this message? And so it seems to put everyone in this position where it's unfair for those who haven't heard, and you being lazy as a Christian if you're not telling everyone about Jesus. But Steve, in your message where you preached about this, and for those who haven't heard, you can catch the sermon on the Riverside YouTube page. You've unpacked some fixed points which help us navigate the conundrum and the what ifs. But I just prepped you, Jace, particularly on what sets Christianity and Jesus apart, and this aspect of love and justice. Because in Jesus we find both, where it can be argued that in other religions it might either be justice or it's either love, but how can love and justice exist in the same place? So how do you reconcile love and justice in Jesus Christ the person, for those who might not understand that?
Yeah, I mean, off the bat, the question is quite, it sounds quite difficult, and it kind of puts the question in a conundrum, because can you be loving and can you be just at the same time? And so starting and looking at who Jesus is and the person he is, I think we can get a better understanding of how to kind of define what love and justice looks like. Because when we see him that as a man that was hanging around with people that weren't like him. He wasn't hanging around with the people that necessarily knew scripture and knew it best. They were the elite of society. He was hanging around with guys and ladies that just were far from God. So there's an idea that he loved those that were downtrodden and wayward from the Father. But then he also, there was an idea that he called them to a standard of following him. So my idea of how Jesus balances love and justice is that Christianity is the only religion that we're aware of that man didn't have to do anything for it. It wasn't earned by man. So love is expressed that he came and he was the solution for our dilemma. So that expresses his love part. And the justice part is that even though we were far from him and we deserved to be away from him, he made a way that we were allowed to be with him through his death. So through his resurrection, it gave us a reconciling with the Father. And I get the feel that those are big words. But yes, justice comes through the form of that we deserve to be far away from God, and we deserve the death that Jesus paid on our behalf. So that's reconciling the idea that we deserve to be far away from him in the justice idea, but he made the way, and the loving idea that he's for us and he wants us to know him and to be saved.
Any clarifying additional thoughts there, guys?
I'll maybe throw something in there. Again, especially for those who are maybe cynical towards Christianity, this idea of sin is a big obstacle for us to get over, and I tried to chat about that earlier. And then also this idea of like God being this judge, and often what gets communicated either intentionally or unintentionally is this like idea of this God is throwing a temper tantrum. So I do this little white lie, and God wants to throw me into hell for the rest of my life. And we as Christians celebrate that and call him a just God. And I think that's a bad caricature of who God is. I think all humans want justice. I think you're inhuman if you see evil and you don't want justice. So we just hear about, just watch the news. And after 20 minutes of watching the news, you're like, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to be held accountable for this? And so the Christian gospel is, we are going to be held accountable for that. So there is going to be an accounting for that. So that's the judge is God. The judge is specifically Jesus Christ. And we would define him as the perfect judge, meaning he's not a guy throwing a temper tantrum and just like beating people for fun. Almost said for the heck of it, pun intended, but he is perfect in his evaluation of the things that go wrong in our lives and in this world, and he's going to hold people accountable to that. But there's also another side to it, and that's the loving side, whereby while that may sound, well, I don't want to be held accountable for my sins, I don't want to be held accountable for the things that I did wrong, and that's where the cross comes in, where Jesus received the justice of God on my behalf. And so by coming to Jesus, the benefits of him experiencing the cross means that I am justified. I get to, even though I'm guilty, I get to experience the benefits of being, in a sense, not guilty, because Jesus paid for my sins. And that is the offer of the gospel. And it is there that we see the justice of God holding us accountable, and the love of God saying, but the offer is that Jesus was held accountable in your place. And we get to trust that actually happened and trust Jesus for that.
Des, I have I don't know if you guys have seen the movie The Judge. It's such a good movie, one of my favorite ones. And it's so hard to not have this conversation without having the judicial and the legal system in mind.
Absolutely,
But the two characters, Robert Downey Jr. and I think the judge is played by Robert Duvall. And I can't remember exactly what Robert Downey Jr. was. I believe he was a prosecutor. And to kind of summarize what I'm trying to get at, there's this really significant moment in the movie that helped me understand the gospel, I think, a little bit deeper. And music was kind of building to a crescendo. And basically what was happening was the judge, Robert Duvall, had let one of these horrible human beings roam free. And then Robert Downey Jr. is on the other end, and he's sort of asking the judge, why on earth would you let someone go that is a murderer who did all of these things? And he was trying to steer clear of the answer because there was a bit of a tense kind of relationship there. And as it built to the crescendo, his dad, kind of with tears in his eyes, the judge looked at him and he said, because when I looked at that murderer, that man, I saw you, my son. And I think that's the part where we go, God playing the judge, he's also playing the father, and he's playing them at the same time. So his love and his justice can coexist in the same place at the same time. And I think it's a foreign concept for us as human beings to understand. But in God dishing out justice, he's also dishing out love. So I encourage you guys to watch the movie. It's awesome.
Yeah, so I've seen a great movie. But just help play out for me. What if God was just loving? Isn't God love? He's described as love.
I can't help but go to my class. I think I've spoke about this maybe 3 weeks back. I wanted to be not a strict teacher, not one of those teachers, as the kids would call them, and would let the guys get away with what felt like murder. And it came back to bite me, because what I'd been doing is I'd been conditioning them to think that, he's going to forgive us anyway, so he's very lenient, he's very kind. And what I'd set them up to think was that there's no consequences for wrongdoing. And that is just not practical. And so it's a silly little example, but it makes me think that just having love, it accomplishes, it creates or conditions a society to think that there's nothing that can happen to me. I can adopt this very liberal approach, and God is grace, I don't need to do anything now. And that's not the case. So that's be my attempt at it.
Yeah, and again, the reason, the question, again, we're living in a world and a belief system, or being taught a belief system, particularly with young adults, is that, man, God is loving. You can do whatever you want, wherever you want, and it's always going to be okay, And like you say, there's going to be consequences that you're going to have to deal with, as you were a teacher who was just loving. And if we went the other way, Trist, what if God was just a judge, a fair, good judge?
I think, this makes me think of just the spectrum, on the one end, like you said, loving, on the other end, very sort of stern and judgmental. And I think if you steer on that side of the spectrum, you're erring on the side of legalism. And I think legalism conditions you to adopt a very rules-based and performance-based mindset, where you go, sure, I've behaved in class, now I'm worthy of sir's recognition. And I think that is so far from the gospel. The gospel speaks against man working towards attaining his salvation. And I think if you are too judgmental, you kind of, or if God is too judgmental, he makes his people think that they need to do things to earn his love. And I think that's far from true. And so you're always going to be treading on eggshells, waking up every day going, I hope I don't sin. I hope I don't do that. And I think that's not life. That's being very sin conscious and not very God conscious. And what does that accomplish if we're just going to steer or try and not do the thing that we weren't even created for anyways. It's a very defensive and very impractical approach, I think. So, yeah.
But I think the world's argument was going to be, no, I'm good enough. You know, Stephen, that was one of your fixed points, is this idea. There's nothing wrong. You know, yes, I might tell a lie every now and then. But on the whole, you know, at the end of it, I've been a good person.
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, we've already chatted about, like, it depends who you measure yourself against. You know, against Hitler, okay, I'm a saint. Okay, against the bad kid in the class, yeah, I'm a good guy. Against Mother Teresa, I know, okay, she's better than me. And then you go to Jesus, and you're like, if I had to measure every single thought of mine against Jesus, every single thought, every single action, not only the things I do wrong, the things that I should be doing, when there's a need, when there's something I should be stepping into to help people out, and I choose not to, or I'm just so blind because I'm so selfish, I don't. Start adding those up, and you start to realize hundreds of times a day I'm falling short. So even if you're a good person, against the measuring stick of Jesus, we fall short all the time. But the other side is this assumption, which was a bit of a new thought to me, but if God only saved good people, that wouldn't make him a good God. That would make him an elitist.
Sure.
And so if you think you're a good person, and if you were God, you would save people according to your standards of goodness. That's fine. Okay, but let's play that out. What happens when something happens in your life and you mess up big time? Suddenly you fail at your own standards of goodness, and if you were God, you fail to make it. And so, well, sorry for you. You know, like, you just don't have a choice. And very few people, I think, live out their lives where if they had to measure up to their own standard of goodness, they make their own standards of goodness by the end of their lives. Everyone is going to come to a point where they mess up big somewhere along the line. It could be privately, it could be publicly. And if God only saved good people, well, not only does that mean that all the other bad people are out, but at some point in your life, you're out too.
Sure.
And what do we do with that? I don't think that's good news. I don't think that's a good God. And so the fact that God has accommodated himself such that sinners are saved, whether you're a good sinner, in other words, you don't do the really big bad stuff, or you're someone who has really messed up, a family, whatever, is that the offer of salvation is still available to you. That is a much better story than the story of God only saving good people.
Steve, I have a... Sorry, go ahead, Scrapwood.
I was going to jump in and ask, so like you spoke about just messing up, and there's this huge sin that even by your own standards we sin. And how do we then recover from that? And how do we, let's say you are saved and then you do sin, it's like, what does that recovery look like? Because often a lot of Christians are held back because of shame, because of guilt, condemnation, self-condemnation. What does that look like? How does salvation play a part in that recovery process, if I can call it that? And how has it looked in your own life? Maybe if you want to go into that.
I think it's maybe a bit beyond the scope of today's one, but you know, just the short answer for me is I don't think the gospel is only how to get saved. So that, okay, I wasn't saved, then I did the magic transaction with Jesus, and now I am saved, and that's what the gospel for. The gospel got me from here to here. Now I'm done. Sure. I think the gospel is for every single day of our lives. And it's learning to remind ourselves, and neuroscience will tell us the value of doing this regularly. We would just do it in prayer. Where let's say I do mess up bad, and I'm able to regularly come back to the core of the gospel. Sure, Lord, because of what you have done, I am forgiven. And I preach that to myself until my heart believes it every single day. Jesus, because of your perfect life, I am forgiven, not because of my life. And Lord, because you live now and I get to live through you and you get to live through me, I choose that every day. And it's going to take days and weeks and months of like, it's just not sinking in to the deeper parts of who you are, but eventually it does. But it's really practically putting in place the reality of the gospel, not only to get saved, but even in the process of getting over some of my issues in my life. The gospel is exactly the same thing that saves me there as well.
Yeah.
Good answer.
I'm going to ask something, picking back off that previous question.
Yeah, I was. It's kind of.
Oh,
I'm scared
Chase.
I'm scared it's a rabbit hole, and if it is, then just bat it off. But it's just I heard this when I was kind of starting out in my Christian journey, just like because I really struggled with the idea of sin and its existence. And one of the theologians I was listening to, he spoke it from the point of view: if you didn't have the choice not to love God, you can't actually love Him. And I think that's so much in part of what this message does is that at some point I got to decide that I want God, and I think that's the hardest point for us to get to is like, how do we get to a point of that I want God? And yeah, Steve, in your sermon when you were speaking about this point, you I can't remember the verse. I think it was the Acts verse, and you stopped, and it was, I think, Paul speaking. When Luke was writing, he said perhaps people might reach out and look for God, and yeah, like that. Now that would be for me is like, how do we get to like, what is that point? How do we as Christians get that as our main goal in life? That we're sharing the gospel, we're living it out, that people are around us, perhaps they might see God, or perhaps they might, because I think that's the most important question of what's actually going on today.
I forget if it was you or Trist earlier, but you just mentioned the fact that Jesus hung out with people who weren't like him. And I think Andy Stanley, he put it this way, he says, people who weren't like Jesus liked Jesus.
Yeah.
So there's something compelling about his life. And for me, I've got to just somehow keep that in my crosshairs. He didn't just hang out with sinners. He did speak to them about the truth of who he was, about their sin. But somehow the combination of his life and his message, there was something appealing about that just kept bringing people back to him. Now, obviously, I can't do that. So on one hand, I can always point people to Jesus, even in light of my failures. Because I don't want people to like Stephen. I want people to love Jesus.
Yes.
And so I think that's a good starting point, is just to always point people back to Jesus and back to Jesus. And whenever they got a concern, but that may be true, but it's not true of Jesus. Oh, but you think Christians are hypocrites. Well, that's great. But Jesus is not like that. And so on and so forth. However, man, when I'm around people who just embody Jesus more, I'm like sucked in, man. And not just me, because I'm a Christian. I see their friends, I see their social networks, and I just see people drawn in. And so there's something for us to be, to the degree that we are able to, with God's help, embody the person of Jesus in my life. And that goes far beyond the caricatures of being this grouchy, hypocritical Christian, or the caricatures of the guy who's so full of truth, but he kind of really seems angry with life, or, the guy is always political on Facebook, or whatever the case might be. I mean, those are such poor caricatures of what it means to be a Christian. And so if I'm always reframing my life and not just going, yes, I'm imperfect, but Jesus is perfect. Yes, that is always true. But part of the goal is more of him in my life, and that there's something truly compelling about that. And that's going to come out in word and in deed. And I do fundamentally believe that for the most part, there's a winsomeness, there's a magnetism about that when you really see it.
Or maybe just a small example of that is being on a holiday, and I mean everyone's around the pool, and I don't know what it is, but the friendlier faces, and it happened to Jody and myself. There was just something about this other couple that was a magnet with our souls. Eventually, getting into conversation, hey, we believers as well. We serving in our church. Like you say, there's just something about Jesus and the person of Jesus that's attractive and draws people in. And I want more of that. You know,
Yeah.
that's the type of person I want to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe if we can just narrow down a little bit and try and answer our question now. We've heard the gospel. We know about Jesus, but the people sitting on an island, stuck away in the remote parts of the world, they may not get to ever hear this message spoken by a person. What happens to them? What does a loving and a just God do with someone when they die? So, Steve, this is a bomb we're throwing on your lap right now. Maybe let's go with Romans, eh?
Look, when I spoke about it, I just wanted to just also get us to be aware of what I want the answer to be. And there's something in me that just wants the answer to be, that dude's okay. That guy and his family is okay. And if I think about a spectrum, earlier Tris was talking about a spectrum, but I talk about a spectrum and I look at one side, it is really how people do try and argue that for those who don't hear the gospel, they are okay. Or for the person who grew up in the Muslim family or the Hindu family, they're okay because they're good people, they're sincere, and we'd call that universalism. And I understand that impulse. I mean, there's almost like a part of me, an immature part of me, that wants universalism to be true. It's illogical, and we'll maybe get to that. But yeah, then there's a complete other side, which is kind of like, man, if you don't hear Jesus, like you're just left with an eternity without him. And I also understand that because so much of what the scriptures are teaching are speaking in the realm of what we have been speaking about thus far, that there's some awareness of who Jesus is, what he has done, and how that salvation works, what you saved from, what you saved for, etc., etc. But I do believe, and it's not about finding a middle zone. Like, let's like not be too far left, let's not be too far right. Let's just find the middle ground and make everyone happy. It's not about that. It's the term I used in my sermon was there are some breadcrumbs where there isn't a whole lot said. I wish there was way more said about this because it is such a bothering question. But there are some breadcrumbs which do address that question. And on one hand, let's recognize it for what it is. It's breadcrumbs. Let's look at it. Let's try and understand it as far as we can, but then let's not exceed our statements, our conclusions concerning the relatively sparse amounts of data that we have. But I mean, I forget who said it earlier, but it's almost this like sense of, well, it would be unfair of God for the person who grew up in the middle of Tibet in a Buddhist family, never heard of Jesus in their life. It would be unfair of God to judge them because they never heard of Jesus. Now, we've already established that even good people are falling short of the glory of God hundreds of times a day. Okay, so there's that side of it. But the other side is we go, oh, but because they haven't heard the gospel, they have no knowledge. Now, if you go and read Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2, what Paul talks about is that there is no one who has no knowledge. Romans chapter 1 talks about the fact that through creation, God has made certain of his attributes known. Now, I won't go there. It's 20, 21, 22 around there. But the fact that God is eternal, the fact that God is powerful can be deduced simply from creation. Basically, you look up at the stars. Wow, if there was a God, he has to be incredibly powerful to bring all of this into being, number one. And he has to be necessarily eternal because he has to pre-exist this creation. So those are two pretty important attributes of God that you can deduce from staring up into the stars.
If I can just interrupt, in that verse, is it not stated though too that man is without excuse then?
And therefore, because I have at least that knowledge, there's an assumption built into that verse that I am going to be held accountable according to that knowledge.
Okay.
And I can't hold up ignorance. I can't say, no, but Daryl Dyers didn't come to Tibet and preach the gospel to me. I'm going to be held accountable to the fact that these are basic facts that are accessible to everybody on planet Earth. And therefore, I do have some knowledge. So that's Romans 1. Romans 2 talks about our consciences. And yes, at an individual fine-tuned level, maybe our consciences can differ, and there's different reasons for that. But at the end of the day, everyone has a conscience. Even someone who is, I used the example of a thief. You'd say, oh, they don't have a conscience because they're stealing all the time. No, just steal their iPhone and see the wrath unfold from them. And because they say, no, stealing is wrong. Don't steal from me. They've just chosen to overrule and override their consciences. But we all have a conscience. And so I'm going to be held accountable with regards to how I treat my conscience and how I live according to my conscience.
Steve, can I?
Yes.
Sorry, man. I just wanted to, I don't know if we're all thinking it, but I can't help but think of people who are maybe, I don't know how to say this nicely, but people who are, from a physical point of view and from a, their brains aren't able to function. So they're very restricted physically, their brains aren't 100%. And when they look outside and they look at the stars, they don't see what you and I would see.
Yeah.
And then I would even go as far as saying, how kind of strained is their conscience? I mean, yes, they would have one, but then I'm just, for those kinds of people who have mental and physical disabilities, what happens there?
So this is definitely one of those big what ifs, and that's the part of the problem with this conversation, is that we can stop with 5,000 what ifs. But on this particular one, Trist, one of the firm points that I always come back to is the firm point of God's character. And that God isn't looking for excuses to, again, that angry tyrant who's just like relishing in the idea of punishing people. But he is perfectly love and he is perfectly just. And the way I understand it is the same way, and again, there's sort of scriptures we can dive into, but is this the similar question of, well, what about if a kid dies at 3 years old, 2 years old, 3 months old, 3 days old? They haven't developed a conscience yet. And while it's not a biblical term, the theological term is an age of accountability, where God in his sovereignty, it's not like a fixed line, like at 8.5. Now, you sin tomorrow, straight to hell, buddy. It's more like God as perfect judge is able to perfectly evaluate your ability to intuit these things and respond according to your conscience. And at some point, you are simply not developed enough to respond to this information, be it external or internal, creation or conscience. And I have come to the conviction, some would differ from me, but most would agree, that those who haven't reached that level are saved.
I would agree with you, Steve.
And then the basic story is David loses a child, and he when he hears about the child's dying, he stops grieving immediately. And his servants are like, what? What's going on? And he says, he can't come to be with me, but I can go to be with him. And so that's one of the passages I go to kind of get to my conclusions there. And so for anyone who's maybe 30-something years old, but is cognitively impaired, I think I would put that under the same category and say God is going to hold them. God in his perfect justice, justice, has the perfect understanding of what they are and are not capable of evaluating, of responding to. And for those who are incapable of responding to creational conscience, in my opinion, his justice means salvation for them.
Yeah, I think our problem is we equate a good, fair judge, humanly speaking. And so, Steve, I totally love and agree with what you've said there. God, in his wisdom, he is both perfectly just and perfectly loving, and looks far beyond everything that we can see and understand.
And again, it's kind of like, I mean, Romans 2, when it talks about the conscience, Romans 2 talks about our consciences can accuse us, meaning I haven't been obeying my conscience, regardless of whether I'm on an island somewhere or wherever. And so my conscience becomes the prosecuting attorney, or it can defend me. And somehow, again, exactly how far do we push that? I don't know, but that verse is definitely strongly implying that if I respond to my conscience, I've got a defense. And then that following verse talks about God judging the secrets of man's heart in verse 16. And that's where I think we reach the boundaries of our own knowledge, that there's a God who sees perfectly where I see imperfectly. Even my own heart. I mean, talk about blind spots. We've all got so many blind spots, but God sees perfectly. And so I've got to trust that in the middle of all of these what ifs, that there is a God who sees with perfect clarity, 100% perfect clarity, and his judgment will be therefore perfect. But it's in a secret place, and I've got to trust that.
Trist, I'm gonna pick on you here because, man, it's hard not to sum this up with a Sunday school answer. You know what I mean? Everything that's been said, how would you sum this up without a simplistic, childlike answer, even though it is that?
Thanks, Daz. Just what's his name? Damien McKenzie just got the ball, and then it's Franz Steyn coming to spear tackle me right now. I don't know if you guys saw that. That was amazing.
It was beautiful.
It was beautiful. I don't know. Hey, Daz, there's so much. It's such a content-heavy topic, and like we've been saying and alluding to, there's all these what ifs and all these rabbit holes that you can veer down, and by the end of that, you actually kind of missing the point. But I think what's hard to not draw from this whole topic is that I don't need to know because I worship a God who knows. And it's hard to not use the very cliche verse of Isaiah that his ways are just above our ways. And when it comes to like checking out these points, oh, I've done this, I've done youth, there's no amount of things that we can do to get our name etched in the book of life. You know, it's God determines that, and it's by his own wisdom and his own knowledge. And thank goodness for that, because I don't want that responsibility, you know. And so I think with all of this, we need to have peace of mind that what God is doing, he knows what he's doing. Our role as believers is still to go out and to preach to all nations that love, that gospel. And I love the thing that Steve said. It's gospel doesn't get you from unsaved to saved. It gets you from unsaved and until saved, and then beyond until your time on earth, you know, is up. And so gospel is relevant for people who haven't heard it, but it's also very relevant for people who have heard it. It just is applied in very different ways. So, yeah, we started with, you know, what do you do with the people who haven't heard? But yeah, I think, thank goodness, God is all-knowing and omniscient and omnipotent. I don't know, Daz. I really
No, dude, that was really good. Yeah, spot on there. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that, but yeah, well done, Trist.
Thanks, Mackenzie. He rocks up every now and then, and you check his hair. It's not bad, eh?
So, anyone else have anything to add on to that beautiful answer by Trist? Otherwise, I think, yeah, there's something about also, there's a limitation we have in our knowledge, and we are only human. And there's at a point in time, we have to have faith and believe. And based on everything we know about a loving Savior and an all-knowing God, there's this element of faith to know that He knows what He's doing, and we can depend and trust in that God. Again, it sounds again like a Sunday school answer, but there's no way to get around that we have to believe, we have to trust in the character of God and what we have learned and what He teaches us about Him.
But Daryl, if I can, you know, I think, you know, you're asking for what's a way of boiling it right down, and it starts to sound like cliche.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like cliche, and I mean, this has at least been true for me, and as I have conversations with people like you, and just being and doing what I do, the cliche is there for a reason, because it's powerful to explain something that's quite complex often.
Yeah.
And I think there's incredible value in recognizing the cliche, but then deep diving all that it represents.
Yeah.
And coming back to that cliche is even more powerfully true now. But I understand all the complexity behind this simple idea, because if we leave it at just the cliche, I think, you know, we left with a partial picture. For example, I'm just going to trust God. That's great, but it's going to leave me passive. Either passive in my own sharing of the gospel, or even in my own just becoming more and more like Christ. But once we listen to a video like this and just come to terms with some of these ideas, you cannot be passive after that. And you're going to end off going, wow, Lord, there's 5 million what ifs, and I'm going to trust you with those what ifs. But I'm energized now to be part of what God's doing in my life, to be part of what God's wanting to do in the lives of others, and even to the far distant points of planet Earth. And I'm now an active participant who's trusting God with the unknowables. And so I think that journey is so important, the journey kind of behind the cliche, and then coming to back to that simple idea.
And I think that's the encouragement, is that there's so much more, and you could quite easily give a Sunday school answer without doing the homework and hard work. And again, that was part of the motivation of starting this, is that you could quite easily defend your faith with a cliche. But there's work underneath the surface, and more I think you use the word nuance to many verses and phrases. And I mean, you say the gospel. The gospel is a complex yet simple thing.
Yeah.
And deep diving that is essential for our faith, and what it means for us today. You know, in a world where context is continuously changing, and how does the gospel meet us today, and what does it mean for us in the world we live in? And we have to be diligent to do the work. And like you say, we could give the Sunday school answer, but we must there's more to it, and guys, we gotta get into it. Let's dive, you know. So yeah, looks like we are out of time, guys. That really went quick again, but again, really good time chatting. Thank you for your time, boys. Any other closing thoughts quickly, if there's anything? Otherwise, we're good. Thanks to those who have watched. Please like and share if you've got any value or found any value in this. Boys, thank you for your time, and we can catch up next week. See you guys. Cheers,
Cheers.